Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Prime Minister Modi left Washington in the early hours of this morning and he'd land in Delhi 2 hours from now. Judging by television and the newspapers, it was a momentous 5-day visit. He seems to have taken Indian audiences in New York by storm and hugely impressed American politicians in Washington. But that still begs the critical question: how much did Mr. Modi achieve? Is he coming back a satisfied man, or just very conscious of the promises he's made and the challenge he now faces to deliver? That's the subject we shall tackle over the next 1 hour as we attempt to come to a definitive verdict on the Prime Minister's American visit.
हमारे पूर्वज तो सांप के साथ खेलते थे, लेकिन हम माउस के साथ खेलते हैं।
And now joining me to arrive at a definitive assessment of the Prime Minister's visit to America is former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to America, Lalit Mansingh, the South Asia Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal, Gordon Fairclough, the Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times and a member of the National Security Advisory Board, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and joining us shortly from Washington, a Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institution and author of India Emerging Power, Stephen Cohen, and the Hindu newspaper's US correspondent, Narayan Lakshman. Gordon Fairclough, let me start with you. I know you're watching this from India, not from America, but what would be your verdict on the outcome of the 2-day state visit to Washington? Would you, from your vantage point, call it a success, or would you simply say this is just a good starting point?
I think you'd have to look at it as a good starting point, but every relationship has to start somewhere. I think that the Prime Minister showed up and made an impression in America unlike any Indian leader in recent memory, and that, of course, drives a political dynamic in the United States as well. Obviously, he got along very well with President Obama. I can't, in my recollection, remember a time that President Obama has co-authored an op-ed with anyone, and certainly not when he's taken the second byline. So that's clearly an indication that the two leaders did get along, and I think that there is an effort probably on both sides to reset relations and move forward.
I'm intrigued by the way you began your answer, that the Prime Minister has made a bigger impression on America than any other Indian leader in living memory. Why do you say that? I ask out of curiosity. I'm not questioning you. I just ask, what is it that gives you the impression he's made such a huge impression?
I wouldn't say living memory, but so, as you were saying, I'm sitting here in Delhi, as we all are, so I was calling some friends on the way over this evening, and you know, even friends who are not big news hounds, it certainly has penetrated the American consciousness that Mr. Modi was there. And I think that that was helped in part actually by the Mars mission the week before. It's been a big couple of weeks for India news in the United States. The Mars mission got enormous attention. The fact that India did this on the budget that it did it, and in fact, one of the things that really got a lot of attention was women engineers in the control room. It had a big impact on people looking at those pictures, looking at what India can do. And then Mr. Modi arrives on the scene. A lot of coverage of the Indian American communities welcome for him.
Narayan Lakshman, if you were to comment on the visit and were asked the question, is it a success? Would you say it was a success because the two heads of government got on with each other, a point made clear by the fact that President Obama personally escorted the Indian Prime Minister to the Martin Luther King Memorial? Or would you say it was a success because, in fact, when you look at the outcomes and the decisions taken, there were things of significance that have been achieved? Which of the two would you say is the basis for believing the visit is a success?
Well, honestly, I think in order of ranking, I would say it is the first and then the second, because both men are extremely charismatic, powerful leaders in their own countries, but yet this is their first contact, and Mr. Modi has literally come in from the cold so far as America is concerned because of the visa ban. And so it is extremely important for them to invest heavily in building that bond, in forging their relationship from scratch, as it were. And they did a splendid job of it. Honestly, everything from the jokes that they made while they were speaking, to the lemonade and the adjustment for Mr. Modi's diet, and then the MLK visit. These are signs that they've established a rapport, and that in itself is a very positive indicator for continued cooperation. Yes, obviously the policy announcements matter, but I put that as second because there was nothing dramatic as we were hoping. Mr. Modi did bring back the nuclear issue onto the table, while earlier there were signs that it might not be on the table. But that was, so for me, that was a second sort of criterion to assess it as a success.
Now, Mr. Mansingh, as a foreign secretary who has been also previously ambassador to America, do you think the media whipped up expectations to such an enormous point that for this visit to be deemed truly successful, it would have had to achieve landmark proportions, which is why someone like Gordon or perhaps someone like Narayan Lakshman both feel that the real value is the fact that the two heads of government got to know each other, not the actual outcomes. And is the media responsible for that order of priority?
Karan, I think it's more than that. If you go through the joint statement, it looks as if all that had been said before. But if you look at the fine print and read between the lines, there are lots of new areas in which Mr. Modi has opened up very creative dialogue. I would say there are three major areas in which he's made considerable progress. One is in terms of the economic involvement of the United States in India, particularly with his Make in India campaign and his urging American companies to take part in infrastructure. Secondly, in the area of military cooperation and the war against terrorism, significant new advances in our cooperation with the United States. And finally, in the regional and global setup, a lot of areas in which people had said there's nothing more that can happen, but actually some maybe incremental progress you can notice here.
Okay.
Mr. Modi overall has shown three great qualities: his stamina, his style, and finally I would say resilience in negotiating with Americans. There's been a lot of give and take, and you can reflect it in the joint statement.
Okay. When you look at that op-ed jointly authored by the two heads of government, something that perhaps neither has ever done before, and then when you look at the joint statement that was issued late in the evening, do they suggest in fact a meeting of minds, a convergence of the interests of the two countries, and at least a profile of things that they can claim that they will achieve down the road, even if they haven't done it already? Or is it just enticing diplomatic rhetoric and intention?
Actually, I think they did a very good job in laying out what you correctly say is a blueprint for what you can do over the next 2 or 3 years. Not just a joint statement, but I think what was equally important was the 5 thematic fact sheets that were released by the State Department on specific topics. And if you look at what happened on the terrorism side, for the first time the United States mentions D Company. Dawood Ibrahim's gang is actually cited for the first time, as far I'm pretty certain, in an Indo-US statement on counterterrorism. They come to an agreement on the hydrofluorocarbon agreement. They actually break the impasse they've had over whether it should be under the Montreal Protocol or the UNFCCC. And this is a personally very important issue for Obama because he sees this as a major legacy, that one of the few legacies he's going to leave behind on the international
And is
scene.
this a concession made by Mr. Modi to him?
Yes, I think it was a compromise where they said we'll do a little bit of both. We put it a little bit under UNFCCC, we do a bit under protocol, but ultimately it will obviously go through. Second, they then look at there's a whole bunch of little microeconomic problems have now risen in the relationship, partly because for the past 5 years not much has happened on the economic side. So they set up a joint working group on IPR. This is going to be very interesting, because if this working group is institutionalized, IPR is going to be a constant headache between India and the United States for the foreseeable future. But now if they institutionalize this, we will now actually have a functional body to settle these problems, rather than, as we do right now, yell at each other, threaten sanctions, and go to the WTO and they yell some more. And then, as Mr. Mansingh has mentioned, on infrastructure, this is Big Modi's plan, but America doesn't build infrastructure anymore, but it does finance it. And so Modi comes in and says, we build an infrastructure platform, getting an institutional body where your technology and your money start to flow in to contracts that may eventually end up in the hands of Japan and China, but that's okay, at least you're still involved. And so you can see too that the two of them have sat down and clearly put together a bunch of little groups and bodies that over the next 2 or 3 years, if they function properly, will actually begin to revive a relationship that has essentially crumbled in the past 5 years into lots of little, basically fights and arguments over micro things.
Before I move to the others, I get the clear impression from what you're saying, particularly the details in which you're setting it out, and the fact that they've actually put their heads together, as you said, to come up with these 5 critical areas of advance, that in fact, this is significant success.
Yes, I think that we actually are seeing the first time since roughly 2006, 2007, an attempt at a blueprint for in an Indo-US relationship. I'll also add, look at the strategic dialogues that have been added to the ones that we already have on East Asia, including one on Indian Ocean maritime security. This is a big development. Until now, the Americans have not accepted the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and they've not necessarily developed an institutional structure to develop a security relationship in India, the United States, and the Indian Ocean.
So this is convergence of political thinking and diplomatic thinking.
Absolutely.
Let's take some of those issues that he's mentioned one by one and actually see how much progress has been made. And I'm going to begin with some of the areas where, in fact, there were outstanding issues between the two countries where convergence was needed. First was India's refusal to sign the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. Now, speaking at the White House, sitting literally beside the President, Prime Minister Modi said he was confident this issue would be resolved soon, and then he added, very importantly, he was also confident that India's food security concerns would be taken care of. Given that combination, do you get the feeling that perhaps the two countries have found a way around the problem, even if, as yet, we don't know the details?
Our latest reporting on that indicates that there's still a pretty broad space, but it can be hard to know unless you're in the room, obviously. And it has been a big gap, and I think it's been a big frustration for the United States. I think a lot of the U.S. trade people see this as an effort to really roll back, not just to prevent moving ahead with the trade facilitation thing, but to actually kind of roll back WTO and broader issues. And for the U.S., they look at it and they say, well, India, you could meet all the caps that you want to meet if you cut out the corruption, run your programs more efficiently, make sure the food that you are stockpiling gets to the people who needs it, then there's no reason to be worrying about caps. You won't be anywhere near the caps.
But Gordon, the interesting thing about your answer, if the feedback you're getting from your colleagues on the Wall Street Journal is that the differences and the divide between the two remains as big as it was, then the confidence that Mr. Modi was echoing as he sat beside the President, talking about how he was fairly confident this would be resolved soon, and secondly, that India's food security concerns would be taken care of, that confidence is either misplaced, or at least he's talking himself into feeling confident, even if the circumstances don't warrant it.
Well, I would guess the Prime Minister knows more about the situation than I do, or the rest of us. So perhaps he has.
Or he's putting up a brave face, which Prime Ministers often do.
Often do.
Narayan Lakshman, I'm going to bring you in on that critical point because you're sitting in Washington. You probably have a lot of feedback from the Indian Embassy. What's your feeling? Did Mr. Modi's confidence on that issue, when he said that he was fairly confident this issue would be A, resolved soon, and B, that India's food security concerns would be taken care of, was that reflecting a point of understanding and convergence between the two sides, or do you agree with what you just heard from Gordon Fairclough, that in fact the differences remain as wide and maybe the Prime Minister was just putting up a brave face?
I think more than any promise of achievement, this is a promise of intent. So both, the other thing that came to mind when you said, mentioning an important area where the Prime Minister suggested that there could be room to move forward is the civilian nuclear deal, where, as we all know, it has been kind of stuck in a quagmire
Can I stop you? I'll come to the civilian nuclear deal in a moment's time. Stick for a moment to this confidence he showed on the WTO differences.
Exactly. Sure. So my point is that I think Mr. Modi has signaled his intent both in this area, in the area of the WTO and TFA, as well as other areas, to try and work with President Obama to resolve the extremely thorny issues that remain in the policy realm. And the challenge for Mr. Modi now is going to be to go back to India, back to Delhi, and work out a mechanism for actually resolving it. Okay. So I think from that point of view, that relates to what you said earlier as well, which is why this is about a success of chemistry. This is about a success of a meeting of minds on both sides. And that is the sense I get, because so far as what we're hearing on the ground here, there has been absolutely not a single whisper of any actual solution in terms of the details of any mechanism that of such a solution.
All right, but that answer is very close to what Gordon said. It's intention, it's hope, it's expectation. Actually, there is no solution as yet that they've reached. Okay, Mr. Mansingh, a second area of Indian concern obviously is terror. It's one that in very many ways the Americans share. Now, the joint statement talks of joint and concerted efforts to dismantle safe havens and terrorist and criminal networks of LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Al-Qaeda, D Company and the Haqqani network. And you heard Pramit Pal Chaudhary point out that this is perhaps the first time America has ever in a joint statement talked about D Company. How significant a step forward is this? Or do you think once again this comes to nothing more than intention and language?
Karan, we had a joint working group with the Americans on counterterrorism way back in 2000. But the Americans didn't take it seriously because for them, their terrorism was different from our terrorism. I think what you see in the joint statement is really a big step forward. I haven't seen that kind of convergence at any time in the past, but the Americans were acknowledging that our concerns were also theirs, that these groups, which were earlier treated by the Americans as part of India-Pakistan relations, not part of the global terrorism problem, the Americans have finally acknowledged that this is a common concern. And what's the language? It talks about dismantling the tactical and financial support for these terrorist groups, apart from the fact that the D group has been mentioned for the first time. And also, simultaneously, the Treasury Department declared these groups to be terrorist groups. So I think what we are seeing is a real convergence of common interest on terrorism. And to that, I would add yet another fact. We are having a discussion the other day on whether Mr. Modi will mention ISIL or not.
Can I stop you there? I'll come to ISIL separately. Let's focus on issues. Let's focus on issues one by one so that the audience can get a proper understanding of where real progress is made and where, in fact, is just intention and language. I want to pick up on that language in this bit about terror, because you heard Mr. Mansingh say that the language was unique and it struck him as being very significant. He talks of joint and concerted efforts to dismantle safe havens and terrorist and criminal networks of a whole range of entities. What does dismantle mean, and what does joint and concerted action amount to? Does it really suggest that America and India will together work to perhaps target LET training camps and other such camps in Pakistan, or is that excluded?
That's a good question. We'll see how that develops. But you'll notice that at the same time that all of these are being issued, the U.S. Treasury issued a notification on its own, putting, if I remember correctly, Lashkar, Jaish, and a few other organizations on that, and HUM, I think, on the terrorism blacklist. And I presume they were going to do that anyway at some point, but obviously they decided to make it, put it into a package with the president, so it looked nice. But that's one of the areas we're looking at, terrorism finance, I think. I think there continues to be be an issue about the future of Afghanistan, which will inhibit, if you wish, until we get a convergence, clear convergence between India and US, about how much they can coordinate actual physical action, military action on safe havens of these countries, of these organizations.
Okay. You know, Gordon, there's no doubt Indian public opinion, and probably every single Indian politician of any stripe, would greatly want some sort of American concerted action alongside Indian to take out LET training camps on the Pakistan side of the border, to target D Company in particular, to target Jaish-e-Mohammed. Is it likely that the Americans will get involved in that way? The language, I know, leaves open the possibility, but do you believe it's a real possibility, or is this just creative language that suggests more than it will ever deliver?
I don't know how to handicap that exactly. You know, obviously the U.S. has not been hesitant about using drone strikes against the Haqqani network and others in Pakistan. You know, there may be a bit of a sliding scale at work there that for some groups it's going to be tightening the noose financially. For others it would actually be direct military action, might be considerably more intelligence sharing. You know, there's a range of ways that cooperation could be carried out.
But of those range of ways, actual physical participation in somehow dismantling, I don't talk about boots on the ground, using, say, drone strikes to dismantle, you think that's the least likely?
I would guess, certainly with U.S. public opinion on drone strikes.
Did you want to comment on that point?
Yeah, just like the key point that I would argue, which is why Afghanistan is important. Why was America carrying out the strikes against even Lashkar in the end? Because Lashkar had begun to attack US troops in Afghanistan, which until a few years ago they did not do. Now, if America withdraws completely from Afghanistan, then obviously it doesn't matter what happens with Lashkar and these groups. But remember, one of the more interesting, I thought was interesting, is Modi also made a call, you must not leave Afghanistan. That's
Absolutely.
the first time an Indian Prime Minister has made that statement in public.
And that's precisely the subject to which I want to turn, because it's linked very closely,
yes,
not just to terror, it links with the other subject we haven't come on to, which is Pakistan.
But if America doesn't withdraw, then the drone attacks immediately come into play. Because those
You're making it sound like an either or rather than yes and yes.
Well, because these guys will attack American troops.
Lakshmi, let me bring you in on that issue of, in fact, Afghanistan, because it's another one of India's major concerns, and there is no doubt a certain level of difference, if not dissonance, in the thinking between the Obama administration and the Indian government over what's going to happen in Afghanistan. Now, Mr. Modi, speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations, went public for the first time with his wish that, in fact, America must seriously slow down its withdrawal from Afghanistan, otherwise it runs the risk of repeating Iraq. That was not reflected in any shape and form in either the joint op-ed written for the Washington Post or in the joint statement the two governments issued later on. All the joint statement talks about is a commitment to continue close consultations and cooperation in support of Afghanistan's future, which may be nothing more than just diplomatic verbiage. So do you get the feeling that on Afghanistan, despite our Prime Minister going public, in fact, the most you can say is the two countries have agreed to disagree?
Absolutely. I think so. And all the language that you've seen is diplo speak for exactly what you said. Because basically the drawdown is an extremely complex process which involves long-term planning by the U.S. military. And, you know, the sheer technical details behind that is boggles the mind. And so that is not going to change overnight because a visiting leader from a neighboring country has made a statement. Yes, albeit a very important strategic player in this game, but that is not going to change this plan at all. So, you know, let's not even pretend about that. So I think, so what does Mr. Modi's statement mean in that case, or why has he said it? I think, again, this boils down to what one of your panelists alluded to earlier, which is trying to persuade the Obama administration that there is need for a greater convergence in the counterterrorism strategy or the security strategy for the region, looking not just at Al-Qaeda and ISIS and global terror groups, but firmly looking at groups like LET, which can spin out of control and switch between either border of Pakistan with very different implications for everyone. So today it's going to be, you know, more terror, maybe sort of border infiltrations and so on for India, but tomorrow it's going to be another Khorasan or someone springing up in the vicinity of Pakistan or Afghanistan and then talking about Western targets. So I think Mr. Modi is trying to make a persuasive case, even with a little bit of force, I would say, looking closely at the language, that Mr. Obama should rejig the counterterrorism strategy, even if he's not willing to do a volte-face on the biggest sort of withdrawal plan that the U.S. has had in recent years.
Mr. Mansingh, I want to bring you in at this point, and the thought I want to pick up on is Mr. Modi's hope, and it is no more than hope, that President Obama should rejig his counter-terrorism strategy. The problem is that as the American withdrawal from Afghanistan gets underway, and remember, by January this year, they'll be down to 9,800 odd troops, and possibly by 2017, they could be down to 0. America's dependence on the cooperation of the Pakistani state and the Pakistani army in particular, because their withdrawal route is extensively through the length and breadth of Pakistan, is going to grow. Now, that is going to have some impact on the way America views Pakistan's involvement in terror and America's ability and willingness to want to take action against that. On the other hand, India views Pakistan as the epicenter of terror, and we believe we're the principal targets of Pakistani-sourced terror. So could Pakistan over the next year or 18 months become an issue of, how should I put it, difference between India and America?
Well, Karan, I think very rightly, the issue of terrorism and the issue of Afghanistan have been linked by most of the panelists. It is significant that in the list of the terrorist groups is mentioned the Haqqani network. Now, the Haqqanis have not been responsible for cross-border terrorism in India, but actually they have been attacking Indian assets in Afghanistan. So while the Americans would take into account what the Pakistanis might or might not do during the process of withdrawal, I think this is also putting Pakistan on notice that even though they have a sense of dependence on Pakistan, they are not going to hesitate in attacking these terrorist groups if they come to that conclusion.
Okay.
But what is significant is that India is now a partner with the United States in attacking these terrorist groups. Whether it will happen overtly or covertly, I do not know. But it opens immense possibilities for terrorism cooperation. One more issue. There is in the joint statement a reference to closer intelligence sharing, both military and civil. And that, I think, is also significant.
Okay. All I point out for the sake of the audience, by the way, is that the Haqqani group was in fact the group that's widely believed to have been responsible for the attacks on the Indian embassy as well as the guest house in Kabul where Indians were staying. So it has actually targeted us, and maybe it also was responsible for the Herat attack just hours before Mr. Modi was sworn in. But let's come back once again to this combination of terror, Pakistan, Afghanistan. I want to put this to you. Is there a danger that today they may have agreed to disagree in the politest possible language on Afghanistan, but 18 months down the road, they could actually drift apart on Afghanistan?
Of course it's possible, but I think there's a broader geostrategic interest that is also helping to bring the US and India closer, which is concern about China. And I think that that is providing some propulsive power on both sides to bring these countries together, is driving, as noted, the interest in the Indo-Pacific partnership. We've seen naval exercises involving the navies of India, the US, and Japan. There is a bit of a League of Democracies kind of group forming that I think the US is very keen to see. So those interests also balance the narrower interests.
Will ensure that the differences over Afghanistan, even if they were to grow, would be contained.
I think it would contain them.